Here at Fight Night Picks, we love to keep the tradition going. Flyweight never die. We've got a really interesting fight coming up this weekend as Canada's Malcolm Gordon is going to be taking on the brother of the former champion, Francisco Figueiredo. And Matt, if you look at it for Malcolm Gordon, 2020 was an absolute wash. 0-2, both losses by finish. He took on Amir Albazi in his debut. In his second time out, he took on Sumaderji. And listen, it ended, well, very quickly. So for Malcolm Gordon, it is weird. You definitely have to figure he needs to pick up a win coming into this. And even if you look at it, when he made his way into the UFC, like, some of his wins were odd. His win over Yoni Sherbatov back with TKO. Sherbatov hurt his rib. Robin Black was calling the fight with John Ramdeen here. John, where you at? Miss John Ramdeen with Fight Network. But when I watch Malcolm Gordon's fights, really offensive, really like to impose his will with his grappling, and he's able to get angles that just most fighters aren't normally able to get. A little susceptible to getting hit, but a really fun fighter to watch. And for Francisco Figueiredo, we found a lot of tape out there. There was tape, and it was difficult to find, but he fought with a number of different organizations. The 5-on-in wasn't the sexiest. He had the fights against Eduardo Souza. If you look at it, 5-on-in, almost 4 years ago, a loss to Souza by split. Then he has the wild one to make his way into the UFC. Really odd fighter too, Francisco Figueiredo, because you'd think and you'd assume maybe like brothers, the Dacus brothers. One's very specialized in grappling. One's a great grappler that happens to be a really good boxer too. But Francisco doesn't really fight like Davison does.
But he kind of does, though. It's weird, because I would say Francisco Figueiredo, the bare bones of his game are similar to his brother, but the problem is he doesn't have any of those, like, championship X factors that Davison does have. Like, Davison, when he hits, it doesn't really matter what kind of a technique he lands. When he lands clean on guys, they just fall down. With Francisco, he still has that kind of, like, old-timey boxer-type stance, but he's either all the way out or all the way in. It's a really odd style for Francisco Figueiredo, because they do like to bring up how good his boxing is, but it's weird, because a lot of his work doesn't really get done in that traditional boxing range. Like, just go back to this weekend's fights. When Conor fought Dustin, when Dustin would have success, it was not when they're all the way on the outside, because that's when Conor can kind of, pot shot you from long range, but when he was on the inside, having those extended boxing combinations, that's when Poirier would have success. Francisco doesn't really play in that range whatsoever. He's either all the way on the outside, and if his opponent ever does try to collapse that space, he almost immediately clinches. And even in the Jerome Rivera fight, a fight that I thought, okay, for sure don't go for any takedowns against Jerome Rivera, because if he's good at anything, it would be his jiu-jitsu. Now, I understand maybe this weekend didn't show that off to the fullest effect, but it is true. Like, he's a BJJ black belt. You probably don't want to mess with him on the mat. And the fact that Francisco Figueiredo was not only able to take him down, but just control him on the mat, it was really impressive, because of all the ways to beat Jerome Rivera, I would say he did it in one of the more convincing fashions. And for Malcolm Gordon, it will be interesting, because all the way on the inside, he is going to be able to use a lot of his own wrestling against Francisco Figueiredo, and for where the odds are at, Malcolm Gordon might not even be the worst bet, just because his style is that, okay, I'm just going to wrestle, and if he can tire out Francisco Figueiredo, which has happened in the past, then he could actually make this fight somewhat competitive. It's just, with Figueiredo, my big question mark comes down to how good is his offensive jiu-jitsu, because with Davison, we know how good his defensive submissions are. He's this great stand-up fighter, so when anybody tries to take him down, he's got that wicked guillotine, where you listen to fighters who've got tapped by it, they're like, no, he's got the squeeze. Does Francisco Figueiredo have any counter to the striking like that? Because when Francisco is on his back, it is a lot of, okay, I'm just kind of being held here, I'm sort of holding on myself. I don't doubt that he has good jiu-jitsu, I just don't think he can use it to the offensive capabilities that his brother can.
So we talked about it a lot in some of the previous breakdowns of Francisco Figueiredo's overall career. Really early on back in 2011, fought John Lineker. He had those two fights against Eduardo Souza. If you look at it his last time out, it was with Jungle Fights at Jungle Fight 95. Great production values with them too. Walid Ismail shouts. And if you look at the way that one ended, it was a little weird. I mean, Figueiredo wasn't favored by many of the fans to get the win, and ultimately he earns himself a chance in the UFC, albeit years later. That fight was back in late 2019. He makes his debut just this year, and it was back in January when he took on Jerome Rivera. Since then, he had fights fall out. One with Jimmy Flick, who just walked into a cage somewhere in the middle of nowhere and said, yeah, I'm hanging it up, while he had a fight booked, and then he was supposed to fight JP Bays. So ultimately, he draws Malcolm Gordon. For Malcolm Gordon, his entry to the UFC was a little weird. He had some different fights booked. He was supposed to take on Alexander Daskalchuk, a guy that you might recognize from his time with M1 Global. Draws Albazi, gets absolutely controlled on the mat, and then takes on Sumaderji and gets finished really early. It was a sub-minute finish at 44 seconds. So all of a sudden, he enters into this fight on a 2-fight losing streak. Before that, some nice wins, but really that 2-fight losing streak, I think that's what kind of controls the odds. And you kind of touched on it, but the fact that it's really difficult to go with a guy in Malcolm Gordon who opened around a plus 195. He's at a plus 250 right now. If you look at it for Francisco Figueiredo, open a minus 230. He's a minus 319 right now. And if we have a look at the Topology votes, 1,015 of them, 92% Figueiredo, 53% by decision, 33% by knockout for the 8% that have Gordon, 45% by decision, 29% by submission. It is a really tricky one because Francisco Figueiredo is just not one of those one punch, one knockout guys.
But I actually think in this fight he could be, and it really does come down to the durability of Malcolm Gordon. I don't look at Malcolm Gordon like a Justin Gaethje type fighter, where it's like, okay, you will go down eventually, but it takes like 200 significant strikes. If you go back to the Submunergy fight, and listen, Submunergy is a far better striker than Francisco Figueiredo, and at least he's a more dynamic striker on the outside. And he lit Malcolm Gordon on fire. And I do feel like the durability of Malcolm Gordon is something to question. I could see Francisco Figueiredo catching him on the way in with some kind of a hook or a straight shot. And I do like Francisco Figueiredo in this fight. I could see it being one of these situations where Francisco Figueiredo wins by stoppage, calls out one of those like borderline top 15 guys, and they automatically give him the fight because of that Figueiredo connection. I could very well see that being the case this weekend.
I have a really hard time with this one. I mean, Francisco Figueiredo, you look at it, 7 wins by submission for Gordon. There's 6. The level of competition for both guys a little sketchy for Malcolm Gordon. Again, the Oni Sherbatov fight, a guy that was on the Ultimate Fighter. It is a tricky one for me. I like Figueiredo in this one because of his pressure and his ability in the scrambles, but Malcolm Gordon, if we know anything, that's where he excels as well. So for me, if it's lined like this, maybe you do like a path to that underdog. For us right now, both going with the Brazilian in Francisco Figueiredo to get the win. Let us know down below in the comments section. Who are you taking in this fight? Are you going with the Canadians? Well, the Canadian and not us? Are you going to go with Malcolm Gordon? Do you like Figueiredo in this one? And in our main event at the end, Matt, Islam Makhachev taking on Thiago Moises. You're not going to want to miss that. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. As we always say, let's get into it.